what we've seen is as people have transitioned to hybrid work and remote work, they often don't have those same opportunities for connecting outside their working group. It can be very isolating.
2Lead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
So here's the first angle or perspective that I'd like you to think about. We all know the power of Outlook and we know the power of Teams. Both tools can serve as a me capability. So if you have Outlook, you can use Outlook for me, right? My inbox, my schedule, my calendar. It becomes a very valuable tool for me scenarios. It's one that almost every employee uses. If we look at something like Teams, it's becoming the default we experience. So yes, it serves me scenarios like instant messages, my calendar, other things like that, but it also services this we, it's our team, it's our work, our working group in how we collaborate and work together, our meetings. And then as we look past the we, there's even scenarios, especially now, where it's becoming the us and all of us tool. And this is a relatively big change because historically in the Microsoft stack, if we said us, we'd probably be typically talking about Yammer and large scale communities. But as I'll talk about today, Yammer is more or less in Teams, right? We think of the main experience. There's a communities app that customers leverage, and we're seeing very high adoption of that communities app. And of course, Yammer's usage in Outlook. Those are still very, very big Yammer use cases in terms of experience layers, and they're growing and becoming more and more relevant. Whereas arguably, the going to Yammer, going to a social platform, going to a community is becoming less of a relevant experience. Again, more embedded. Another example is the all of us. We've talked about in the previous session about how intranets are changing, and certainly intranets need to be where people are already working. It's not enough to say go to the intranet anymore. It needs to be where they are. So the all of us story is also changing with Viva Connections and the ease of which we can bring intranets into the Teams experience. So yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's use the first example here where we talk about the very real challenge of externally collaborating. And historically, I would argue that Teams was not the center of the universe when it came to external collaboration. It was actually a really poor experience. If you don't know this, Teams has been a really big challenge to work externally because you have to do something called tenant switching. So in the top right-hand corner, you have to switch tenants when you want to share and collaborate on Teams. And so for a lot of customers, SharePoint or other platforms have been dominant here. If you want an extranet scenario, you might roll up a SharePoint online extranet, give people access to it, and have the benefits of that wonderful space. While that's still a valid use case today, what we're finding is the customers that have started to adapt these shared channels or connected teams early, because this has been something we've been baiting with a lot of customers, it's led to them actually decreasing and actually in some cases almost completely replacing the need for SharePoint extranets or other alternate extranet models. They find it's very, very effective for external sharing. And so this means that not only is Teams becoming more centric for external sharing scenarios as we look forward, as your own organization deploys things like shared channels, but it also actually helps adjust some other risks. So if you don't know this, in Teams today, if you have a Project A and a Project B team, to share across those teams, the kind of current IA pattern that you'd be recommended is to create a Project A-B team. And so now as we look forward, we don't need to create a Project A-B team. We just share a channel or a subset of content across those teams. And so that reduces the team proliferation. Now I want to be clear technically, when you create share channels, it does create other challenges. There's still governance at play here because what it's actually doing on the back end is it's creating SharePoint sites, and those SharePoint sites still need to be governed, and so there's still considerations there. So let's move on and talk a little bit about what does a modern collaborative experience look like, and why does it need to, why is this a good example of it? Well, the first thing you can see here is it's easy to share the team. So essentially to share a channel, you essentially choose the channel and then you essentially share it, with individual people. It's a very easy frictionless ability to share it with targeted teams or even teams you own, right? To make it even easier to find the teams you're looking for to share with. And so those are all really great starting points. The fact that Microsoft has essentially won the AD or identity in the cloud battle with Azure AD is I think no one really contests that. So the fact that this is using all that, the innovation for lifecycle management and protections and other things like that on the back end also certainly gives it a lot of strength. But there's another aspect to it as well, and you'll see this with other technology platforms, some a little bit more mature than others, where it's really clear at all times if there's an external participant. So if there's an external participant, I know they are external. It's clear there's always an icon, there's always some sort of indicator. These people are external, and that really helps with reducing those data leakage risks that I mentioned earlier. Of course, we can protect our data and do all sorts of things to make sure that doesn't happen. But even in most scenarios where we do that, it's still very helpful to know when is an external party, who are the external parties that can see what I'm producing and putting in here, and so on and so forth. So those things becoming more front and center and visible to employees certainly helps with reducing those risks and also making it easier to know, how do I communicate more formally, less formally, how should I work in this environment. You can even see things like knowing which channels are external becomes a really useful reference point for not just traditional governance, but for individual teams and how they govern and manage their content and information journey. If we look at a little bit further, and this is the real value of shared channels long term, it's the fact that a shared channel isn't just like the ability to have instant messages and back and forth like app mentions and other useful techniques, but that it incorporates files, it incorporates lists, it incorporates apps in the back end. And there's sort of two types of tabs today in Teams. There's pinned resources or bookmarked resources, and then there's apps, like actually integrated apps. And in both cases, they're shared with the shared channel. Now, obviously, there's some gaps here that Microsoft's working through in the coming months, but this is a good indicator of two things. One, that the future of sharing isn't file-centric or messaging-centric. It's more broader than that. Yes, it's still going to have those elements, but you need to have scenarios where you want to share, other third-party tools with that or other kinds of experiences and have sort of a gateway or a connective digital hub for that external sharing scenario. And Teams can service that need, especially with the way these shared channels are developing. So I think this is a really good example of that. And we'll come back to this because there's this integration richness that employees are expecting, and they would like to have that kind of be default. And so as this evolves, I think this will be one of those key reasons why this will continue to champion a lot of these external scenarios. Of course, each of these kinds of collaboration scenarios still is powered by things on the back end. So if we think of a collaboration, it is very true today that metadata still matters. If you're not familiar with this, really quickly, folders that you've historically had in, say, a file share, those names of those folders essentially could become metadata, right? So if I drop a document into Canada here, I know that it relates to employee agreements, employee files, and human resources. The department is human resources. The type is employee files, which might incorporate different sensitivity and security rules. The nature of the file is an employee agreement. So I know all that by just looking at that hierarchy, and we've always had that. What's different now is that that information can be represented on the file itself so that it can be used for process automation or for protection or lifecycle management and more. And so metadata is not new. And one of the ways that people have used in the past very well is to use default metadata. So you have that folder hierarchy on the left. And as I drag and drop, if I put a file into Canada, region equals Canada can automatically be applied, as well as department equals human resources from 3 levels up. So if you don't know this, SharePoint and the underpinning of Microsoft 365 for files, that's been a feature for many, many years. It's since like 2010 of SharePoint, you've been able to have default metadata at a folder level. And so what that means is users don't fill out that metadata. They just put the file in the right place, and we inherit that metadata for the file. This can even be displayed in the file, which is what I'm showing on the right-hand side here. So again, this might be new to you, but for a lot of people, this is kind of table stakes. It's how we've been working on files, and enabling advanced collaboration, process collaboration especially, is enabled because we have metadata, right, that empowers that, and which is a more efficient and a more powerful version of collaboration than sort of baseline collaboration. What's different is this has been great if people know where to put the content. Now, I'm sure we all have been there where someone doesn't know where to put the content, or they put it somewhere, but they put it in a place where someone would manually have to open the file to inspect it to figure out what each metadata attributes would be. So this works great, again, when you kind of know it's a container, it's kind of a one-to-one rule, things like that. But when you start to need to extract things like in a contract, the milestones, when is this contract going to expire, that can be really difficult because you can't just drop it into, well, expiries for this date, put it in this folder. You'd have every date would have a folder. It would be crazy. So instead, what we need there is we need a different way of doing that. And historically, unfortunately, that was where we'd ask users for metadata. We'd say, you fill out that metadata, tell us the milestone, right? When you upload this contract, we know it's a contract because you put it in this place. So we're just asking for a bit of information, and then we can run processes on that. What's changed is AI has changed the way that this works. Now, a lot of times it's cheaper and more efficient to actually have the AI auto extract that particular metadata. So in this example, this is just a forms processing sample, but you can see I have essentially a form on the left. On the right, I'm saying what fields need to be extracted, and it's mapping them to different metadata that will be actually column values in a library. And then this can then be run. So if you drag and drop, 200 invoices or purchase orders or you name it, that'll automatically extract all that metadata with extremely high accuracy. Now, this is just one version, which is called forms processing, where the fields are in a specific place. There's also ways to do this where it's reading the document, and based on the terms and the language of the document, it's extracting it, and that's building a content understanding model. Both are actually very intuitive to build. The training is quite easy for end users that are like baseline trained to do this. It doesn't require developers, capital D or lowercase d developers, to do these. And so it means that metadata extraction and automated document understanding, and by the way, creation automatically from documents as well, those are all much more accessible and more much lower in cost than they've historically been. And so this is really facilitating a new renaissance, or a new huge shift, where there's more and more focus on process collaboration now, instead of just document collaboration, and then process collaboration on the people side, separate from the technology. The technology is now facilitating that and offsetting, these mistakes that we make when we extract that metadata. It's creating more reliability, and it's allowing those people that historically would do that work to focus on how to make the process better and more efficient than how to get the data that enables the process in the first place. And there's more to talk about here, on process management. I don't want to dig too deep into it. I just want to highlight that process collaboration is certainly something that's getting better with more rule-based models, more accessibility. I think of the Power Platform capabilities, Power Automate is the most accessible, to a non-technical audience, because you can template it and you can use those templates. And there's more innovation. Microsoft is spending a lot of money to make this experience a lot easier and better for people. That metadata we talked about also, of course, improves search, and search is a prerequisite for collaboration, because often what we want to do is a form of collaboration is finding a resource someone else created and using that as a baseline, right? When you go to create that artifact or that document or whatever it is. And so search being capable where you have refiners like the ones I mentioned is very valuable. So not only do we have default metadata as one way to support this, but now we actually have ways in which search can be more empowered, not just because it's more intelligent nowadays, but also because it can be more enriched with data, and that can certainly help with reuse of content and things like that empower collaboration. I'm going to skip over the information management stuff. I'm assuming you guys kind of understand all that. But again, with compliance, with collaboration comes compliance. We need to make sure that it's kind of there by default. So if we're doing default metadata, we can have default information labels and policies. If we have default locations that are structured and stored for people, and they put the content in the right place, we can have default sensitivity rules and other things applied to the content as well. So there's lots here that we can do without necessarily asking, and this is important, the users to classify content or take an extra step. Just take the work they're already doing, they're already placing the content in these places, and just apply these kinds of rules around that content. If you're struggling with this concept, one of the other things that's changing, and it's changing for the better, is that we have more intelligence than we had before. So a relatively new announcement from Microsoft is that there's this thing called the SharePoint Syntax Assessment. SharePoint Syntax is that thing I was describing earlier that allows you to do that document enrichment or understanding, where it auto extracts, properties, or allows you to automatically build documents. In both cases, that tool essentially gives us visibility across your organization, your Microsoft 365 footprint of how libraries are being used and what areas might be good opportunities, right, for something like syntax to improve it or take it further. On the right-hand side, you also see an example of compliance score and the compliance reporting that you'd get in once you've classified content. In both examples, we actually have both tools that automate the classification of content in your organization, and we have tools that helps us score, whether it's security, compliance, productivity. There's actually score models for all of these, and a lot of customers really don't take full advantage of that. And so we would encourage that. And sorry, this is a little bit hard to see, but that's Microsoft Purview, which is the compliance stuff on the right that I'm clicking on. So if you click on it, you'll be able to go to the reference link there. All right, so that was a lot, but all we really talked about was team files, believe it or not. And so collaboration is a lot more than just files. It's a bunch of other categories. So let's speed this up because I know you're all like, oh, this is too slow. For the recording as well, again, you guys can always go back and slow things down. But there's a bunch of things that are also happening. Today, anywhere, anytime collaboration is enabled. In most organizations that you have Microsoft 365 and who've rolled it out correctly, it truly is something that's a promise that's been realized. However, as we mentioned earlier, we want to collaborate more. We need to collaborate more, yet a lot of our collaboration time feels unproductive, especially meetings. Meetings are really bad for this. And so my highlight here would be to think about meetings not as during the meeting, like how is the meeting conducted there, but think about what happens before the meeting and after the meeting. We know that meetings are overused. A lot of times we throw a meeting at a problem to solve it when another form of collaboration, like file collaboration or sequential collaboration, where we're working, where you're messaging me and I'm working on a file, putting comments in it, and you're working on that, or co-editing at the same time and co-authoring, where we have a meeting, but now the meeting's focused more on the co-authoring experience. Those are all ways to potentially improve meeting outcomes. At the same time, if meetings aren't, before the meeting, if the collaboration is not occurring before the meeting, then the meeting itself often is starting on the back foot. You start the meeting and not everyone's on the same page. There's all sorts of gaps there. So the more we can collaborate before the meeting, the more effective the meeting can be. The more we collaborate after the meeting, the same thing, right? The action items that come out of the meeting. A lot of people don't need to be in the meeting. They can just go and look at the transcript and the recording and zip through it much quicker to get the insights they need and to take the actions they need. And so what we find is when people say, like, I love Zoom and we're using Zoom, I'm not trying to pick on Zoom, but just using it as an example, it has a great meeting experience just like Teams can have, but it really doesn't have that before the meeting and after the meeting experience. And when you think of your digital experience, right, we're talking about employee experience around collaboration, that needs to be all encompassing. It needs to be as important to think about, if not more so, before and after the meeting, as much as having better meetings themselves. So certainly there's more we can do there. Another thing you can do is you can look at insights by the tool nowadays that actually tells you that. So this is an example of Viva Insights or My Analytics, where I see insights for me. So I'll tell you guys, one of my mistakes that I make a lot of times is I don't RSVP to meetings. I'm really bad at that. And so, I'm a RSVP anonymous, right? I'm really bad because people don't know if I'm going to attend a meeting till the last minute. And so I've been using the metrics where it tells me that to improve, right? Okay, I'm at 20% of the meetings that I get, I don't respond to. Now I'm at 10%, et cetera. And it's something I have to constantly work at. Like if I leave it for a month, I promise I'm not great at responding again. So because I get a lot of meetings. And so this is something that I need to do a better job of. That's an example of a personal insight around meetings that helps us be more productive. The technology today provides this free of cost. It's core built into the product in a number of different ways, these kinds of insights. Now, there's other things that we could pay a premium and we can invest in for our team. So our broader working group, I might notice that our time in meetings are typically larger meetings with more people. So they're more people, typically is a less efficient meeting. And if we know they're long meetings, again, that's a pretty good indicator of a problem area. Now, that may be situational. Maybe there's times in the year where we have more of these. Think of like fiscal planning. But this is something where I can really dig into the data and I can inspect it at a working group level, right, at a team level. And so this becomes very, very helpful and valuable insight that improves meeting outcomes. That's not limited to just the we areas. I'll show you other examples of the all of us or us areas. So here's another pattern that we've found problem, and this is very true with the great sort of resignation and the reshuffling that we've had with hybrid work. People have more burnout, right? Because the boundaries of work, especially when we're remote and hybrid, are more porous, and there's more ways that our work can get to us and distract us and other things like that. So how do we potentially manage that? Well, one way that we've seen some success is where we get a bit smarter after you send the message, right? If you've ever sent an email, you get a little bit smarter. So what's happening at the top of this one is it's saying, hey, maybe before you send this message, you should delay the send of this message. I think it's a good idea to delay the send because this person's time zone is different than yours. This might not even be like an employee, like I might not be working after hours. They might just be different time zones, right? So this is all the kinds of considerations we need to do. That's an individual example. Another individual example is I'm taking time off. And so how do I make sure I'm proactively coordinating my responses to meetings and follow-ups and things like that before I take that time off? How can the tool actually help me with that by saying these are are the ones that are in conflict of the time you're about to say you're out of office. You haven't responded to these. Do you want to do that while you're marking your out of office time? Things like that. So the technology will continue to evolve and innovate and improve these at a personal level, but it's not limited to that. As we mentioned before, the we level can also be tackled. So looking at, where is the after hours collaboration occurring and how is it being broken down, right? We can even do that at a larger scale level. This is an organization where at a team level, we're looking at, what kind of after hours collaboration is happening. Is it meetings, which are much more disruptive? Or is it just instant messages and things like that? And so maybe this would change, how we tackle and approach this from a leadership perspective or a manager perspective. And then you also see examples here at the organizational level, like how does the distribution of after hours collaboration work? And I'll share more about this in the employee management discussion later today. But this is certainly all kind of data sets that we now have access to with, a very minimal investment of something called Viva Insights that allows us to potentially improve outcomes around collaboration. So those are a few quick examples of taking collaboration further and how the employee experience around collaboration could be improved. Here's another big one. With hybrid work, we have less of those in-person events. So a lot of times customers would use things like they would have a barbecue or they'd have some sort of event, and that would allow you to connect with people outside your working group. Well, what we've seen is as people have transitioned to hybrid work and remote work, they often don't have those same opportunities for connecting outside their working group. It can be very isolating. And so this can lead to retention risks, and it can lead to other kinds of challenges where people are not as productive because they can't leverage their full network as they would be able to in a more traditional environment where you'd enable that. So organizations have always taken some proactive measures to create these connected whether they've prioritized it or not is a separate matter, but they've generally taken a front seat in making this happen. Now with digital, it's very important that organizations continue to take that ownership of enabling those connections outside of people's working groups. It's not fair to expect that of a manager. Now, I will say a good manager will focus on the career development of a resource. They'll do this anyways, but again, this is something that needs proactive effort and support. And so there's, again, 3 examples. I have a me example there where you can actually see who you're losing touch with. So I haven't had a one-on-one email, meeting, et cetera, with this person for 2 months. It'll tell me that, right, at my personal insights level. What about things like at the team level, right? Okay, well, one of the problems we have with our team is that there's not a lot of cohesion, so that their teams, the networking of our team is not really tight within the team, and it's not really extended outside of the team, right? We can look at metrics like that, or we can look at on the left side things like network diversity at an organizational level. We had an acquisition, how is that? How has the networking worked for that acquisition group? Because that's really going to change the retention metrics around that post-acquisition cycle. And we even have examples here, which I'll come back to in the ideas of like icebreaker tools and things like that you can encourage for people to create connections outside their working groups. So there's lots that we can do in that regard. So let's move on from that and talk about some other major changes. This one is how knowledge actually affects collaboration today. Now, a lot of times when we think about collaboration, we don't really think about knowledge, right? We think of, the artifacts, the documents that we're working on, the things that we're trying to produce. But a lot of that content, arguably most of the intellectual property or the IP value of a company is in its assets. And those assets are often locked, right? They're difficult for people to discover, to explore. Yeah, we're lucky and we have some stuff in curated collections on intranets, knowledge hubs, et cetera. But most of the time that curation is never up to date. It really struggles to maintain those collections. So how does technology changing this, and how is the employee experience changing around collaboration for knowledge? Well, now we have adaptive dynamic knowledge sets where this is something called Viva Topics, and it enables you to see and access, the related resources, people, recommended and related resources, spaces, digital spaces, teams, SharePoint sites, Yammer communities, et cetera, as they relate to a topic area. So you're in an email, you're in a Word document, you're in a SharePoint, page looking at some content, or you're in Teams, whether it's instant messages or a channel conversation. You'll see these topics light up, and when you hover over them, you'll see more information about that topic. And this content that you're seeing is automatically or dynamically suggested based on the AI. The AI is actually making these pages for you. And then what you can do is you can then curate that. You can, of course, curate the page to your heart's content. There can be a segment owner who's curating it, or it could be, something that you really distribute across the organization. But what that enables is then we can say, well, these people look like they're related to this topic. Now I'm going to pin them. I'm going to acknowledge that they really are experts on this topic. And so you can kind of have 2 levels of insight there. And why this is so powerful is because it's in the context of my work. The knowledge is just in time in where I'm already working. And this is a big change than the way we've historically done it, because the way it worked historically was, if I wanted to collaborate on knowledge, I have to go to that knowledge, wherever that knowledge is. I have to go find it, discover it. That's a lot of tax, a lot of pain to pay before I can actually play, right? Before I can actually support that knowledge. Now you see that essentially almost completely disappearing with something like Viva Topics in that experience layer. And it's not as simple as just saying, hey, it's there when people use it. Even when you suggest topics, like when I go to hashtag something, it actually suggests based on the context. It's called Context IQ. It looks at what I've been writing and then suggests that. That's the same thing with app mentions, by the way. If you've never noticed this, app mentions and things like topics will actually look at the body of whatever you're writing and say, what's the most likely topic or app person for this context to share. And so the more intelligent that gets, again, the faster our velocity for collaboration is enabled to be. And so the more informed we are, right, with knowledge during that collaboration cycle, also the more accurate and effective our knowledge will be, our collaboration will be. So again, very, very important change and transition. So that's, essentially knowledge. That's an us type thing for sure, and an all of us type experience that's brought into teams front and center. And as well as Outlook. As I mentioned, Outlook's a very important experience. So here's another one, which is learning. And so, we often think of learning as individualized. It's my learning, it's your learning. I'm a manager, here's your learning, and I give it to you. But what we're finding, especially today in a remote employed workforce, is that learning can and should be more collaborative when possible. So it can be our learning, right? It could be the learning we do together, right? It's the learning that I want to share with you because it was so helpful for me. I want to share my learning, right? I want to connect you with learning. And so this is where Viva Learning really stands out compared to other techniques in the industry, because we've always had capital L learning, right? LMS systems for a long time. And I'm not saying you shouldn't still do those, right? There are curated, authoritative learning scenarios, but you see an example here where I can quickly type in something like leadership and quickly share that learning object, that learning reference with a person in the organization. That is the power of Viva Learning. It's the fact that it can be social by design. It can be peer-to-peer learning. It can be learning from a manager who doesn't have the authority to, or even the time and effort to create an official learning path, right, within the LMS, but might want to encourage or incorporate better learning within their staff so that they can close key skill gaps. Because, and we'll come back to this in the last session today, this is a huge area of challenge today, right? Skilling and your staff is definitely a critical area. So Viva Learning is, yes, it's great for LMS connection. I can integrate this with LMS systems. I can do a lot more. But thinking of it as a collaborative learning solution, I think really is closer to what you want to use something like Viva Learning for. All right, so that's learning, right? My learning and team learning can both be incorporated into this sort of collaborative we first experience. Here's another example. This is Ally.io, which is used for OKR and goal management. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit more, I think, in the next session. But it is something where we actually collaborate. It's a new pattern of collaboration. Historically, most of the time, you'd have objectives, and they would be given to you, right, by a leader or a department or something like that. Now what we're seeing is users and employees want to have some ownership of those objectives. They want to have a sense of representation in that process. And so objectives are often collaborated, at least in most modern organizations today. They're starting to be collaborated on more and more. And the objectives of a fiscal, like organizational fiscal objectives, need to be rationalized down to the point where you can figure out, like, what are the things I do when I check in this widget on ADO? How does that correlate to the organizational objectives? And we need to show that mapping all the way up. And that's what Ally.io and tools like it, which are relatively new from a collaboration perspective, enable. And so this is one of those patterns where, of course, it's it's very much a management first discussion, but at the end of the day, it's still something that actually we find when we roll this out with companies, that employees actually collaborate with one another, so that you actually see them talking about their goals and these OKRs with one another, which is a natural progression. And then they start to share like what's working, what's not, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a new collaboration topic area and a new form of collaboration, not just upwards, right, to the organizational alignment stuff, but also for employees to collaborate and align with one another, how they're contributing together instead of just individually. Now, of course, again, start with individual, but your goal here isn't to stop at individual collaboration for OKRs. It's individual OKRs. It's to get to collaborative OKRs, because that's going to be a better long-term fit. All right, so that's the sort of performance insights in a nutshell. Again, there's lots more that we could talk about. We don't have time, unfortunately. I wanted to talk about like tasks and approvals and things like that, but for the sake of time, I think it's just important to understand that all the different ways in which we work and collaborate together, there are newer techniques, there's new approaches, and there's new automation, and especially integration with these tools. The fact that approvals work on your phone anywhere, anytime, the fact that they can be more intelligent, as an example, the fact that tasks can be flexible with buckets and easy, drag and drop style experiences, to really robust things that are powered by Project Operations Center or Project Online, etc. So there's lots to discuss there. So with that, I want to change and pivot a little bit, and I want to talk about a real challenge around collaboration today. Almost all my examples have been in very Microsoft-centric organizations. You're Microsoft-centric, so these collaborative experiences are naturally going to be integrated. They're naturally going to be easier to do. What happens is, as we look ahead, we find that a lot of times organizations have multiple clouds. And while there's a goal to consolidate almost always to Microsoft, right? Microsoft 365 is still the hub of your digital workplace. It's your goal to consolidate to that, and Microsoft Teams being at the center of a lot of that. The reality is it takes time to get there. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. The first comment that I would have is that we know that some customers have Zoom or Slack, maybe through an acquisition or because there was a short-term need, and some of those are going to be displaced, right? Those are redundant investments. Sometime, hopefully, Slack gets replaced by Teams. Hopefully, Zoom gets replaced by Teams as well. In that example, the reason sometimes this is harder to do is situational, but I'll use an example of Slack. One of the reasons it can be hard to migrate is because Slack has an app ecosystem, and it's not the base collaboration experience that you're replicating with Teams, and then you would just transition the content over. It's that you have to recreate that whole application collaboration experience ecosystem with Slack, and that's what makes Slack more sticky or challenging to migrate. Now, you still migrate it. We do lots of Slack migrations, but the point is that's why Slack is still, while it's shrinking in market share, it's going to take a while to go away. At the same time, with mergers and acquisitions, sometimes you inherit these kinds of tools, so it takes cycles to get there. So what you want is your collaboration experience to be integrated with these things whenever possible, so that it's more seamless, so it's easier. But when possible, we will consolidate. So speaking of that, how do we potentially make that experience better? Well, the good news here is that today, there's 700 plus apps and counting in Microsoft Teams. So you have a massive ecosystem that's pre-integrated into Teams. And this is a really robust ecosystem. Slack that I mentioned is integrated into Teams. Like these vendors that are direct competitors there's still entry points and ways in which you can use Teams with Slack. So it's important to understand that when we think of our employee collaboration experience, even if you're not Microsoft centric, your goal is to create a cohesive and consistent employee experience around collaboration. And that's made possible with things like Microsoft Teams, which obviously I've talked about a lot today because of these integration points. Now, I'm going to highlight a very important distinction. Microsoft also announced last year, and this is a big change, that vendors like ServiceNow and other companies can use Microsoft Teams, the whole platform, right? The messaging, all that stuff, the meetings, clients, etc., inside of their own apps. Now, while this may just seem like, oh, okay, that's nice. So if I'm in ServiceNow, I'll be able to have, like, ServiceNow doesn't have to build their own chat engine. They can use Teams. They don't have to build a meeting engine. They can use, the Teams kind of video stuff, et cetera, from that. That is true, right? They get all that benefit, but it's actually more important than that. And I would really suggest watching for build announcements and other things later this year, because I think what you're going to see, and this is my prediction, is that Microsoft will double down on that, where more of the entire platform of Teams is made available if you've integrated, the chat or the meetings or these other capabilities into your platform, your other app. And why this is important is because today Teams is the gravity well. All these 700 plus vendors want to integrate with Teams because that's where users are. We already mentioned it. Users today, they're in Outlook and they're in Teams. So if we integrate with Teams, all of a sudden we have access to those users where they are, and that's a really big benefit. However, if you have an experience, you want people to go to it sometimes. It's not like you don't want them to go to your SaaS application. You definitely want that. So when you're encouraging people to go there, what if you don't lose any of that collaboration fidelity all of that collaboration integration, as well as the integration alongside of 700 plus apps and counting, that could be enabled just by integrating Teams. And that's where I think Teams is going to really continue to be, the cornerstone of collaboration in the ecosystem, not because of where it is today and because others are integrating into it, but because it will be integrated in other places. And when it is, it's not just Teams, but Loop and all sorts of other core capabilities that Teams empowers that will be auto-integrated in those places as well. So you don't lose that fidelity and, more importantly, that integration and connectiveness to the other knowledge and content and other things that matter to you. Topics would work in those spaces, right? In those third-party tools in the same way it would work in core Teams. So that's the direction in future and why Teams has such a strong capability of being kind of like how Microsoft won the identity challenge in the cloud. They're the, AD on-prem, and Azure AD online is the identity 100% world leader. They would be the leader here in collaboration as well and maintain it because of that. All right, so let's talk about what this also means. One of the other challenges with apps is that not everyone is building apps. You're not all ServiceNow companies and things like that. So how do you fit your enterprise app needs? Well, the truth is almost all of it will be low code application development. So 65% is the most of the industry terms are around that amount. It's coming quick. So we're really seeing a lot less traditional, capital D developer work and a lot more lowercase d developer work. On the developer shortfall, actually an updated number is 4 million. 4 million developer shortfall is what we expect in the next 3 to 4 years. It's a big developer shortfall. So further incentivizes that low-code app development. It'll continue to be a wave that you should all be associated with in some way, shape, or form. The other one is that more apps than ever will be created. And so why are we creating all these apps? Because they solve problems, because we're modernizing. And so if you're trying to understand Power Platform, I would really encourage you, because we've talked about process collaboration, we've talked about file collaboration today and instant message collaboration. We haven't really talked about collaboration on apps. And in fact, you can actually do a lot there with Power Platform as well. So I would really encourage, whether it's you or someone to really explore how quickly and easily you can build a Power App using Teams, using the Dataverse and the Teams experience. Because again, I fundamentally believe all of your sort of apps experiences should be Teams-centric, even if it's just the launch point or the way that people interact with it in the long term. And Power Platform enables that. Now, another example that I wanted to bring out here, and sorry, this slide got messy with the reformatting, but on the left-hand side, we have application modernization, and we do a lot of this with customers. We still have customers with Lotus Notes applications, right, that we're modernizing. And when we do those modernizations, we ask ourselves, is it something that's collaborative? Because almost all apps that exist aren't me apps, right? They're almost always we apps or us apps. And so those apps that need to be modernized, you really want to ask yourself, can we make it so that the experience, the end experience where you interact with this, could that be Teams-centric, right? Could it be Teams-enabled? Could it be integrated alongside of Teams? So the 700 plus integrations and all those other things we talked about could be right there with it. And that's something that we found has had a lot of success, right? Framing it that way has led to a different perspective of looking at these app modernizations. It's led to better experiences. It's led to new ways to use the data and the way we're working on that with external parties. Because remember, all these apps can also automatically work with external parties if we want to, right? Using, those Azure AD investments and things like that that are core of building an app in Teams or building an app in the Power Platform stack, et cetera. So I do want to highlight that collaborative apps are definitely on the rise, and app modernization is still a very real challenge that we're going through. And so my ask is that you think about that, the things I've talked about today and how that fits.